Thank you very much, Sebastian, for that very kind introduction, and Pascal, for your wonderful hospitality while I've been here. I want to congratulate Yohanns again for his award. Edith, thank you very much for that lovely presentation of EMBL. So this is a most intimidating lecture room to be giving this presentation. I think of all the very impressive places I've lectured, this is second only to the Vatican in terms of a place to give a presentation. So I chose the topic trust in science because I believe that all of us as scientists consider that it is our reputation that we cherish more than anything. And if the people we advise don't trust in the science that we present as being solid, reliable, and worthy of listening to, then why is it that we are in the business of promoting science as a basis for basing public policy? So let me start here with, this is our building in Washington, the National Academy of Sciences, and here's the statue of Albert Einstein, which sits out in front. And the National Academy of Sciences was founded by Abraham Lincoln to provide advice to the nation on any matters for which evidence can provide better decisions, actions, or policies. And so the question that we ask is, does evidence matter in guiding decisions? And what I'd like to start by doing is giving you just a few examples. I could go on for hours, but I'm not going to. I'm going to give you just a few examples from the last few decades in which evidence-based reports provided by the National Academy of Sciences to the government definitely made a difference. So let me start. This was a report back in 1986 when the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, was asked the Academy in response to non-smoking advocates, health advocates, who were worried about the topic of secondhand smoking, people breathing smoke from smokers. And they said, okay, airplanes had smoking sections and non-smoking sections, but they said all that air gets recirculated. What's the point? We're all breathing the same air. So should airplanes ban smoking altogether? And they asked the National Academy to look into the question. So the National Academy put together a very distinguished panel that had scientists, health professionals, and engineers on the committee. And here's what they found, was that at that time, back in the 1980s, the precision to which that passenger compartment that everyone was sitting in on airplanes was not made to the best standards. And during airplane flights, pinhole pricks would develop in the passenger cabin that had to maintain air pressure. And it was only the tar and nicotine from cigarettes plugging those holes that actually allowed the cabin to maintain air pressure. So if airlines suddenly banned smoking on airplanes, airlines would not be able to maintain pressure at altitude. So what the National Academy wisely advised was yes, you could ban smoking on airplanes, but you needed to do it in a graduated way, first banning smoking on only short hops, and allow the airlines time to fix this problem. And then eventually, after they fixed it, then they could ban smoking entirely. And that's exactly what they did. And so now we all enjoy smoke-free flights. And no one ever suffocated on an airplane. Then in 1988, this was a project that we weren't actually asked to do, that the National Academy dreamed up all on their own. They thought, let's sequence the human genome. And why should we do it? And they came up with all the glorious things that would come from a project to sequence the human genome. And they dreamed big. And at the time, this was not long after the moon landing, they thought, this'll be a moonshot. And they laid out what might come of it, new industries that would come of it, new cures, new possibilities for society. And it actually inspired 2 human genome projects, a public project that was led by Eric Lander and a private project that was led by Craig Venter. And the fact that there were 2 led to, just like the race to the moon, a race to sequence the human genome. And we know that this has led to a multi-billion, well, probably hundreds of billion-dollar industries from the sequencing of the human genome, and payoff in advances to health and even sequencing technology. In fact, it became not a moonshot, but actually a Pluto shot. Because if you look at the difference in how fast you can sequence during the time of the Human Genome Project versus how fast you can sequence now, the difference in speed is the difference in driving a car from your home to work versus driving from your home to Pluto now in the same amount of time. Okay, so this is my last one. This was a more recent report in 2009 when the Justice Department asked the National Academy to comment on how good is the science in forensic science. And of particular concern were the reliability of eyewitness testimony, bite marks. If you have a bite mark impression, can you actually say who the perpetrator was? Blood spatter, hair samples if you don't have the DNA from the roots. And the report from the National Academy was there actually wasn't much science in forensic science. The end result is now thousands of inmates on death row now have their cases under appeal because they were convicted using evidence that is now suspect based on its reliability. So these are actual people that would have been put to death based on faulty evidence. So does science matter? Absolutely. And now scientists are trying to come up with better ways. Obviously the gold standard is DNA evidence, but there are others that we're trying to put better science into it. Now, science can inform other critical issues, such as disasters and climate change, powering the next green revolution, new forms of energy. It's hard to imagine any area of society for which science can't inform it. But in order to use science, we need to have trust. And it was very disturbing when the word of the year back in, I think this was 2017, was post-truth. Post-truth, as though there is something beyond truth that we should be paying attention to that is anti-truth or beyond truth or something that replaces truth. And in the post-truth world, feelings and intuition began to be valued over scientific analysis. And non-scientists become disturbed when scientific conclusions change. So I want to talk about what we as scientists need to do to counter these two trends. So I want to talk about these in two separate steps. The first is, how can we ensure that science is trusted? And how can we also ensure that scientific conclusions are solid, that we are not dealing with a crisis of confidence in our scientific results? Now, one of our members of the National Academy of Sciences is, in fact, a very valued member of our council, is a psychologist who put together this plot on these two axes that looks at the two dimensions of trust. One is competence, and the other is warmth. And we tend to trust people that we not only think of as being competent, but also as people that we feel warm to. So it's hard to feel trust in someone that we don't feel also has our best interests at heart. So someone might feel, we might view them as competent, but if we don't think they're viewing our interests as their interests, then we aren't really sure that we trust them, because they might be competent, but they might be competent and not care at all about us. So as you can see over here, that scientists are viewed very high. In fact, maxing out the scale over here, I seem to have ruined this, on the competence scale, but we aren't viewed as especially warm. Whereas nurses, teachers, child care workers are much higher on the warmth scale. And so we need to worry about how we're coming across in terms of warmth. And this plot, I should say, is from Susan Frisk, who's a psychologist. You can Google her. She's at Princeton and does a lot of work in this space. What's the reason for this? It's something that's in our DNA as scientists that sort of prevents us from maxing out on this warmth scale, and that is we base our findings on evidence, we expose our work to critical review, and the reviewers are always picking it apart, and we have to subvert our feelings not to get not to take it personally, so we always put ourselves in the background. We are skeptical of our own results. We avoid bias, so the results should be independent of the investigator. We're always putting ourselves in the background. And so this leads to the two worlds. Science in journals is only worth publishing if it's an advancement or an overturn of accepted views. And the scientist remains in the background. The scientist is dispassionate. And we always push to the forefront all the caveats and uncertainties. Whereas what the public wants is the public wants to hear the consensus. They want to hear what everyone agrees on, not all the stuff that is different and that is exceptional and new and an advancement. The public wants scientists and their stories and how they're real people. They don't want the scientists to remain dispassionate and in the background. And uncertainty makes the public uneasy. They think scientists don't know what they're doing, rather than being the honest presentation of what it's all about. So this is why these two worlds are why the scientist seems to be cold and not warm to the public. It's part of how we're taught, and we have to overcome that if we want to be trusted by the public. So that's something that we almost have to work into our education program if scientists want to be viewed as warm. But then we have to teach our students that, yeah, but the norms of science teach them to publish in a different way. And then these norms of science about showing your data, sharing your results, are something that we also teach people, but unfortunately, what we tell them to do and what people actually do, we're falling short on. For example, this is a paper on which I was co-author on something called the top standards. How many of you here in Europe have heard about the top standards? Okay, so there are over 5,000 journals and organizations that have signed on to these. All of Elsevier, all of the Nature journals, Science, so all of Elsevier means that Cell is part of this. Taylor and Francis is talking about joining on. So, 5,000 journals, that's a lot. And so I'm a little surprised that it's not better known here. If I had asked this in the US, probably 2/3 of the hands would have gone up. But the top standards are standards which journals are increasingly signing on to as requirements for their authors for data sharing, materials sharing, showing their methods, etc. And if you are an author and want to publish in one of those journals, you have to meet those standards if you want to publish in one of those journals. And it's to promote an open research culture so that your work is reproducible because your data's available, your materials are available, your methods are clearly laid out. If you've used any code, your code is cited and it's available through a DOI or a link to the code, etc. So this is all coming through this movement. And here are all the standards. I'm sorry, I forgot I had a slide of it. Here they are. Citation standards, data standards, analytic methods, which is the code, research materials, that you've got your data analysis lined up. It's encouraging pre-registration of studies, pre-registration of your analysis plans, and it's encouraging journals to publish replication, although increasingly the replications are also posted on preprint servers. Okay, and then finally, I just wanted to end by talking about signals of trust in science. Increasingly, science is disseminated through very diverse channels. The traditional journals, but also through expansion journals, open access journals, many journals which have been labeled as predatory because they take your money. They say they've put your paper through some sort of peer review, but they don't. They take your money and they don't do any kind of quality control before they publish it. And then, of course, all of the preprint servers, which also post work and allow it to be cited with there being no knowledge of whether there's any quality control to their work. Now, what that means is, I'm old enough to remember the days when there were sort of two buckets. There was work that was peer-reviewed, and there was work that was not peer-reviewed. And if it was peer-reviewed, you trusted it. If it was not peer-reviewed, you didn't trust it. And now we have this plethora of ways to disseminate work, and it's very difficult to know what to trust, because there's work that is claimed to be peer-reviewed that isn't, and there's work that is peer-reviewed and you can't tell the difference often. So I view this as a community problem which we need to solve. And we need to find ways to signal trust within the community, and even more importantly, to people outside our community, to policymakers, to managers, to journalists, to everyone else. What are our standards and what do we trust? And we have to do it in many dimensions. How do we trust what's been peer-reviewed? How do we trust if papers have gone through a statistics check? How do we signal that a paper has gone through an ethics review, that a paper has gone through, I don't know if you call it here, ERB approval, which means that if it's got human subjects testing in it, that a board has approved that human subjects testing. And all sorts of other kinds of checks that a paper may want to go through. If it claims its data is available, is the data actually available? Are the materials actually available if it claims that? All of these sorts of checks. So one method is badging. And who's going to be the organization that actually gives out badges to show, yes, the data is available. Yes, this work was pre-registered to show the plan for the work, and it followed it, and here's the result. Yes, the materials are available, and we checked that they're available. So these are the kinds of things that I think we can do as a community that will build trust both internally and externally in our work in a future era where there are many avenues for work to be disseminated, and confusion both within our community and in the public about what we can trust. So I'll end there, and thank you very much. If there's time for questions, happy to take them.
All right, we have some minutes for questions. So who wants to react to Olivier Pironneau and then Geneviève Alnouzny?
We have a big debate in Europe about integrity, scientific integrity. How do you link this with your concern?
Yes. So I think this is all connected to scientific integrity. I think that, again, in the olden days of my youth, we largely connected integrity to the reputation of the individual. We knew who to trust, and therefore we would trust their work. Now what's happening is the community of science is getting very much larger. And so it is becoming much more difficult to know exactly who to trust because it's a much more international community. There can be different standards from nation to nation in what is considered acceptable norms. And it's also the problem that there can be very good science that may come out of very young people who have not yet established a reputation. But yet, if we have appropriate norms that can be replicated and certified, we could have a process for that person to build a reputation for integrity. Right now, what my concern is that integrity tends to be conferred upon people over time, and also conferred upon people based on word of mouth, which doesn't scale necessarily with the size of the enterprise right now. So I'm trying to look at how we can build a system that might be more robust as, you know, we're hopefully bringing in new recruits from African nations and South American nations and other underrepresented groups in a way that will be fair and open.
Geneviève Almousni.
I was very interested by your scheme where you're putting the perception of the public in parallel with the way scientists behaved. And in a way, the message that could get across is that the scientists should pay more attention to the sensitivity of the public. But I'm just thinking as well that conversely, it may be good that the public can better understand the logic behind the behavior of the scientists, because that there's doubt when you do science is something that is important, and that this is then considered as confusion by the public is a real confusion. And so I think we also need to better explain the scientific approach and that the public can be better educated. So I think there are two sides of the coins, and I'm afraid it would be bad if the scientists would conform to a public expectation that is not a scientific approach.
So, Geneviève, I think that is a wonderful point, and I think that this is something that we're trying to rectify in the educational system. And I know that the new science standards in the U.S. are very much aligned along with what you say in terms of teaching science as a structured, unbiased approach to learning the laws that govern the natural world. And slowly, those will make it through as, you know, each generation gets older. Nevertheless, the difference here is even if everyone understood that, there is still the issue of, does this person care about my problem? And that's still something else. So I do think that even if everyone understood that the results the scientists got were unbiased and they didn't cook the books or try to get some answer that was wrong, everyone likes to think that the scientist has a heart. That the scientist has a heart and they will still want to listen to me, and even though the result they have is an unbiased scientific result, they still care about my problem and will, given all the possible solutions that science might have, they will try to find a solution that will work for me.
I totally understand, but I just thought it was important to make
Right.
the distinction.
And I
but
think
to make
that's
scientists more
yes.
human
Yes.
is definitely
right. And that's all part of the education system. I agree, and I think in France you're doing the same. Yes.
Daniel Kaplan on the left there.
Do you think you stressed the quality problem for the publication? Do you think there's also a quantity problem? That is, is any system possible if we don't reduce the total number of publications by getting away somehow from the publish of perish era?
So 2 brief points on that. First of all, my hope would be that with the rise of preprint servers, there will be less pressure on people to publish papers that really should never have been published in the first place. That they'll just post it on a preprint server and it will get no interest and they'll just decide, oh, I don't need to publish it. Secondly, I really implore all leaders in academies and all faculty at universities to really work on what is the incentive system right now in universities. I know that there are a few leading ones that are really trying to change from a quantity system and one that is based on impact factors. I've seen, for example, a few places in the US where they're instead just asking for a brief narrative from for people up for promotion or tenure to say, just pick a few of your papers. You don't even have to tell us where they're published. Pick a few of your papers and tell us what you found and what the impact of that was. And that's it.
On this side, can you tell us your name?
Yes, my name is Paola Antolini. I am a scientific journalist, but I am as well a social scientist. I am an anthropologist, PhD. So thank you for your nice presentation. I am very glad to be here, honored. And my question is, shouldn't we, as the anthropologists do, usually put a plural, the values of science in public policy? I mean, science is constituted by many horizons. And also, sometimes when I am doing the dissemination, I feel that there is this beauty of science. Science is poetry. As Marie Curie was saying, we belong to those that thinks that science is a beauty. And also, I am very often using art to vehiculate science. So what do you think about this approach that might be innovative and that once when science is good, it's like the coffee aroma. You don't need to add anything. Okay. It's good. Okay. So what is your vision for the future of science dissemination? My last question is that very often in the public opinion, we forget somehow how science is the social progress. So at once I deal with the social impact for the CNRS today, for the gender policy in science. Thank you.
Okay, so the National Academy deals all the time with this dichotomy between science's social progress and science for its own sake. And we see both of those as perfectly wonderful reasons to do science. We've quantified throughout the history of science how science has benefited mankind, and for every dollar spent on science, the great return that one gets from it, and that we wouldn't, most people would be dying in childbirth and things like that if it weren't for science. But also, I think the public innately understands the beauty of science. Two areas of science, when I was editor-in-chief, that I knew were absolute winners in terms of non-scientists wanting to read Science magazine were anything in astronomy and anything that had to do with dinosaurs, okay? You knew that those were absolute no-brainers, and they were probably going to lead to nothing of practical interest within the next 5 years, but yet the public could never get enough of them. Scientists themselves could never get enough of them. So, and it's because of their intrinsic beauty and interest. We love to know where we came from, and we love to know where we're going.
Very nice. Daniel Louvard, the last question here on the left.
Here.
And Eric.
This is a question and a continuation of the education problem that you raised, and you gave an answer already to Geneviève. I assume that when you talk about education, you talk about high school student, college, universities. But I think there is a group of people who have a very important role in the communication about what is a scientist, what scientists do, are the journalists and the media. So don't you think that this is also a very special education where the journalist and anybody involved in media and communication with the public TV and others should actually receive the right education? What is a scientist? What the scientists care first? And those have the responsibility to actually interpret why sometimes we are too cool and not warm enough.
So, I'm not going to speak for the situation in Europe. The situation in the U.S., I don't know how many of you know what it is, but there's been a giant contraction in science journalism in the U.S., with media all over the country reducing their coverage of science. And so the few science journalists that are left at the LA Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, National Public Radio, a few other places, are the best of the best. And there's nothing I need to teach those people about science journalism, believe me. And then there are a few great journalism programs, like the Knight Journal Fellows at MIT and a few other places around the country, where anyone coming up to backfill, any of them who retire, can get great training by starting out as a young journalist and going there and studying at the elbows of great scientists at those institutions. So, perhaps the situation's better in your countries in terms of science journalism, and you actually need to train people. But right now, it's really sad because our schools of journalism are actually retreating from teaching science journalism because there are no jobs for them. It's really sad.
Eric Westhoff, this is really the last question. Yes.
Okay. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much for this very timely presentation. So now the preprint servers, they were invented for speeding the dissemination and to prevent scooping, being scooped by etc. But now a lot of papers are put in the bioarchive and with no intention of being published anywhere else. So why allow citation in peer-reviewed journals to cite such papers that are not peer-reviewed? Does that contribute to the confusion between good papers and
Yeah, so as you likely know, Eric, there has been a tradition of citing non-peer-reviewed material long before the preprint servers began. As you heard from Sebastian, I was director of the USGS for many years. USGS put out its open file reports for many years. Open file reports were a place to deposit data, maps, detailed analytical work that was not peer-reviewed material. That work has been cited as much as many publications that are peer-reviewed. It all conformed to USGS fundamental science practices. So in a way, it had strong standards behind it, but it was not peer-reviewed. So I think it's very hard for many journals to draw a line on what is citable and what is not. I think it is up to the savvy reader to look at these, and also the reviewers to say what they think should be cited and what they shouldn't. The one thing I will say is that the preprint servers, once a paper has been published, they will put a link on the preprint server to the published paper, so that if you go from a paper that cites a preprint to that preprint, you can see the link to the published paper, and you can go and see, did anything change in the published paper, and then you can use that as a key to say, okay, was it cited for the right thing, and do I still believe that? And if it's never been published, then you just say, caveat emptor, I don't know if I believe what this is being cited for.